As energy prices across the European Union continue to climb, many have been left scratching their heads over possible solutions. Now, this could come in the form of renewables, we're talking about solar or wind, or even nuclear. My name is Angela Scoogens. I'm reporting from the TVP World studio in Brussels, and I'm joined by a guest who is going to help us try and dissect some of these thorny issues. Now, this is Conall Heussaff, a policy analyst from the Brugal Institute. Hi, Conall.
Hi there.
So you recently published a paper about EU energy prices, and the major takeaway that I read is that the energy prices in the European Union are significantly more than in North America. Can you expand on this?
Sure. So yes, you correctly picked that up. They're about 5 times higher, sort of depending on the metric that you look at. If you look at the wholesale gas price, comparing the two sort of benchmark prices in Europe, it's 5 times higher than the US. And the reason for that is relatively straightforward, this gas price difference. It's that the US has a lot of domestic gas resources, shale gas, so this shale gas revolution that took place sort of in the 2000s. They have access to a lot of cheap gas. They can frack that out of the ground, consume it domestically. It's relatively cheap. You can ship it by pipeline basically, or transport it by pipeline. Whereas to get that gas to the EU, you need to basically liquefy it, put it onto an expensive ship, keep it cold, very cold, to ship it across the Atlantic, then regasify it and distribute it around Europe. And at the end of that supply chain, the costs are 5 times higher. So we're at the end of a long supply chain of US gas, whereas they're sitting on top of it.
Yeah, they're getting the direct pipeline. And do we know where in the EU, do we have the figures around where this is being felt the most acute?
It's broadly felt pretty evenly across the continent. There are some differences. Some countries have more access to, cheaper gas sort of regionally, but because of the way gas markets balance, basically, the marginal unit coming into Europe affects Europe broadly. There are regional differences, but it is felt basically across the continent relatively evenly. Of course, your dependency on gas makes the situation worse or less. Some countries use gas a lot for heating. And the other sort of critical factor is that Europe uses a lot of gas for electricity generation too. And again, this is different by country. Some countries are more reliant, some countries are less reliant. For example, France has a lot of nuclear capacity, so it needs less gas. The Scandinavian countries have a lot of hydro capacity, they need less gas. But still, across the continent, this sort of dependence on gas, both for heating and industrial process, but also for electricity, sort of percolates these extra costs through the system.
And as TVP World centres on Poland and Central Europe, do we know any of the characteristics for those regions, if they're being felt more or less or anything like that?
A lot of these countries would consume a lot of gas also. The other important piece of context is, of course, this gas used to come from Russia.
Yes.
Through pipelines into various parts of Europe, Eastern and Central Europe, and that was a lot cheaper. This is pipeline gas. You don't have all of these additional costs that come with liquefied natural gas. And so, yes, most of those countries would be dependent on gas for all of the above reasons, for heating, for industrial processes, and for electricity generation, and they would feel the effects too. In fact, probably relatively more so than some Western European countries.
You say more so. Could we quantify that? Do we know how much more?
The numbers are there. I haven't done the study, but you could look at the local gas prices, the local electricity prices, the dependence on gas in the electricity mix, and this would be pretty revealing of the dependencies there.
And something else that was in your policy brief was about how renewables could fill the gap. But as we know, there are a lot of infrastructure issues surrounding renewables, transmission, storage. Is renewables the silver bullet? Are there other problems that could come out of this if the EU is not ready?
There is no silver bullet, unfortunately. But I put forward decarbonisation broadly, renewables being one key component of that decarbonisation of the energy system, as really, I would say, not a solution, but probably the only solution to Europe's high energy costs. And that's because the war in Ukraine, the dependence on Russian gas has revealed that actually being exposed to volatile fossil fuel markets is a security issue, is a dependence issue in its own right. And the reason why European prices are so much higher than the US is because I mentioned we're dependent on importing their gas. And so switching to a renewables-based system or a system with other clean components in it, nuclear, for example, in France is already widespreadly used. This system is much more, it's domestic based, it's based off domestic energy resources, it's more secure inherently, volatility in global markets won't affect that system, and the costs over time will become more stable. It's an open question as to whether they can be as cheap as the US. Probably they can't. There are other reasons why the US has cheap energy that I discuss in the brief, even cheap clean energy, but our chances of closing the gap and also being less exposed to global volatility are best placed with a clean energy system, in my view.
This might be a dumb question, but often when we hear media reports about renewables, critics are quick to say that renewables failed here and now people have been left without power. Obviously, renewables are reliable, but are there enough renewables to sustain the energy needs of the EU?
Not on their own. At least, well, yes, probably on their own if you were to maximise all of the resources, but maximising all of those resources is a challenge in its own right. It's an infrastructure challenge, as you mentioned. I mean, most studies looking forward to sort of the 2040 EU electricity system, for example, put renewables at about 70% of the final generation mix. So it's not meeting the entire needs, but meeting the bulk. And yes, there are very extensive and sort of well-founded studies that show that that is technically possible to do. There's enough wind in the North Sea, wind in Europe, solar potential in Southern Europe to meet the electricity needs. But delivering the system to get there is a policy challenge, it's an infrastructure challenge, it's an investment challenge that we still need to really undertake.
It's interesting you raised that because I wanted to ask you whether these political shifts that we're seeing across the EU where certain governments are leaning closer towards the right, whether that could impact the rollout of some of these renewable systems. I mean, there might be more conservative governments that don't want to take these kinds of risks. What do you think about that?
I think it is a risk. I think it's in some sense, I mean, there's a risk that they, because of ideological or cultural reasons, sort of don't perceive these additional benefits that come with renewables. They see renewables as some sort of, green instrument for sustainability that, we should just deal with China, and if China was to reduce their emissions, we don't need to, or some argument against it. But there are these additional benefits of renewables that I've listed, of sort of the security benefits, the stability of the price, that I think any politician should see as a good solution to our current issues. But I think it is still a risk. I mean, there are counterpoints to it. For example, in the US, I mean, Texas is a notoriously sort of conservatively leaning state, and it has the highest share of wind in its electricity generation because wind is economically competitive there. Yeah. It's a sensible thing to build. So I think if politicians allow the sort of, the economic signals, the sort of signals for the right efficient types of technologies to play out, renewables will play a big part just because they're the right option in many cases.
You brought up China. That's something that I wanted to raise with you. We know that at least 80% of solar imports come from China, and there's obviously a bit of a geopolitical tension between the EU and China. Does the EU need to get serious about manufacturing renewables and stop relying so heavily on what China can export?
I mean, to an extent, yes, and I think this is underway. There are economic challenges with that. I mean, the case of Northvolt, yes, struggling in Sweden recently, illustrates that it's not so easy to just build, develop economically competitive clean tech manufacturing industries in Europe, but there is a huge policy push to do this. I think it has to be balanced. I mean, China still, there's a reason why we buy the Chinese solar panels. It's because they're the cheapest option on the global markets, and we don't want to close that option entirely. It's just being strategic about the relationship, about the dependence. I think there's one point that I think is important to illustrate here: the sort of energy dependence on Russia that was in place before the war in Ukraine is not the same sort of energy dependence that would be in place or is currently in place on China, because on Russia we're dependent on fuel that you constantly need. You use it once, you burn it, it's gone, you need to buy another unit, and that flow has to keep coming. With the technology that we buy from China, it's an asset. You buy it, you put it in place, it's there for 20 years, it keeps producing energy. So the dependency is not as sensitive as a fossil fuel dependency. Of course, it's still there, and we can make very ambitious sort of decarbonisation plans that would be reliant on these technologies to an extent. But I think having that distinction is important.
Do we know how the EU could approach Russia after the war, the invasion of Ukraine wraps up in terms of gas? Do we know if those relationships will, return to what they were before?
There is no sort of public declaration that this would be open. I would absolutely hope that door is closed, but one can never say never. And I think if the war was to have some sort of resolution or at least sort of pause, I think the calls from certain parts of European industry might go stronger to say, well, look, we have this cheap gas that we could just get again. It would solve a lot of our competitiveness issues. Should we not just pursue that? And of course, I mean, it's been demonstrated the geostrategic risks associated with that. And in the long run, as I said, and as I point out in the paper, I think the most secure route is to become less reliant on these imports in general.
Yeah, absolutely fair. And in the paper you mentioned the various EU mechanisms aimed at improving the energy market. You spoke about the European Green Deal. Is Brussels pulling on the levers that it can to improve the energy situation, or is that yet to come?
Frankly, I mean, I set out in the paper a little bit the temporal dimension of the changes that you can make from a policy perspective to energy prices, and within a couple of years, to the overall energy cost of the system, there's rather little that you can do. I mean, the system is kind of the system that you have. You can push out a little bit of gas, for example, and become less reliant on it. You can build a little bit more of cheap solar, and that'll drive down prices a little bit. But structurally, you're kind of stuck with the system that you have for a few years. And that means that the options that are available is really moving around those costs within the system, reallocating. One consumer pays less, another consumer pays more, trying to rebalance the system to arrive at a sort of more optimal allocation. And when I say one consumer pays less, the sort of current calls are to give energy-intensive industry cheaper access to cheap energy.
I mean, what if we just flood the market with investment? Could that fix things? Or is it, as you said, it would take a couple of years to catch on, the technology to be developed, all the systems to be properly put in place?
Yeah, I mean, we are planning to flood the energy system with investment. We are investing huge amounts into wind and solar currently. We are investing tens of billions of euro a year into the grid in Europe, and are dialing up that investment every year. And that's necessary, and we need to do that not only for the geostrategic reasons, but for the climate reasons, for the need to decarbonise our system. But I think that those investments pay off over periods of 5 to 10 years, not over periods of 1 to 2 years. And these sort of acute competitiveness issues that we're dealing with are still on this, few years time span. And that's why the issues that we're really trying to, the policy levers that are available are really distributional ones. It's who pays and how much they pay, and can we change that allocation? Managing that is a very difficult question, because reducing costs for industry will probably push up costs for households unless you put it on the taxpayer. And is that really a better outcome? It's hard to say.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. You can stick around and continue to watch TVP World as we cover energy security in more detail.